This episode is going to be quite uncomfortable, but very important to talk about. This is a subject that basically everybody has experience with, but not many people talk about in the explicit and detailed way that we're going to for this episode. So, Joshua, let's just get right into it. How do you explain pornography addiction to skeptics who don't really believe that it exists?
I begin with the basic definition of addiction because we can all agree addiction exists. So whether it is porn or cocaine or gambling or cigarettes, I explain it in broad terms of what addiction is. I also explain the fact that along with being a pornography addict, as I was for 24 years, I was a porn addict or I was an alcoholic for 22 years. So I do know what it's like to be a socially accepted addict because of the alcohol, which we all agree is an addiction. And I can, let people know just how they are similar. I have my story of going through it for 24 years. I have my story of personally going through early recovery of that took place 2-3 years when I started 11 years ago. I have my story of ongoing recovery, which is getting nearly a decade long. And I have my stories from working with over 600 clients in the last 5 years. If this wasn't real, none of this would be happening. And ultimately, when people say to me, and I can throw the science at them, I can throw whatever I want at them. But what I've learned over time is when somebody wants to be adamant that it doesn't exist, there's usually some sort of incentive for them to say that it doesn't exist. And I respond with the simple statement of, well, I hope that you're able to live in that ignorance forever. I hope that you never find out the truth.
The truth is always very scary. It's difficult to confront because pornography is kind of like, it's not even an explicit addiction, it's like a shadow addiction. You don't realize that you're addicted.
Everybody knew I was an alcoholic. You smell, you slur, you walk funny. If you don't know what you're looking for with porn addiction, you're never going to see it.
So, what's happening in the brain and with human behavior when it comes to pornography addiction versus, and we can use this as a contrast for the rest of the episode, versus alcohol addiction?
Well, when we can get into this in a moment, alcohol addiction, along with drugs, cigarettes, these are man-made substance addictions. Even something like heroin that exists naturally as a poppy seed has to be processed. So these are man-made processed chemical processed substance addictions. When it comes to something like porn or sex or gambling or video games or food, these are process addictions. And there's a difference between the two that I can get into in a bit. But it all what I try to explain to people is it all takes place in the brain. Food addiction doesn't take place in the stomach. Cocaine addiction doesn't take place in the nose, and pornography addiction doesn't take place down between your legs. All addiction takes place in your brain, and it takes place because you do not have the proper coping skills. When you were young, you found this thing. In this case that we're talking about, pornography. Maybe it is alcohol. I found both. You find something that helps you cope with life. Why do you need to cope with life at that level when you're that young? Because there's some kind of trauma or there's some kind of event happening that you can't manage. And then, like you're receiving a life raft suddenly showing up, oh my God, I can start looking at naked people doing naked things. And this makes me feel really good. And you don't recognize, because people won't talk about this taboo, you don't recognize that you're consuming this differently than most of the other people. And you quickly learn pornography makes a bad day okay. And pornography makes an okay day good. This is how you can cope with stress. This is how you can cope with anxiety. This is how you can deal with your problems. So once you internalize that, which these days is happening for most guys and girls between 11 and 14, when the pornography addiction really takes root, it's because you've got no way to handle the problems of your life. You are not developing proper coping skills. You don't know how to deal with the world's problems on the world's terms. So, and why should you learn? Because you have this fun thing you can run off to. Looking at naked people is fun. Touching yourself and having an orgasm to these naked people is fun. And it's fun for a very long time until you realize, holy crap, I can't stop. Even if I want to stop, I can't. And what this used to do for me, it doesn't do anymore. That's when you enter the realm of addiction. And for myself, alcohol mainly helped with numbing. If I just needed, and this is the difference a lot of times you see between process addiction addicts and substance abuse addicts. Substance abuse addicts just want to numb. They just want to go away. They want to, whether it's on an upper like ecstasy or cocaine, and they're going to be the most energetic out there person, or whether they want to retreat with something like meth or heroin, it's about numbing one way or the other. With process addictions, and when you think of this, you can kind of see the thread between them all. It's about power and it's about control. When you're playing a video game, you're Mario in the cart. You are Zelda with your little sword. You are whoever the guy is called in GTA driving the car down the street. There is a score. There are levels. You are in charge of this guy. You can have a gun. You can beat people up. You can do whatever you want through this avatar. And that's very powerful. And the success comes with the ranking. I just went to my next level. I just got this score. Well, translate this over to pornography. And what you are seeing is nobody on that screen is ever going to say to you, hey, I have a headache tonight. Nobody on that screen's ever, you didn't take out the trash today. Or you got a bad grade on that test. Or why are you late to work? Nobody on that screen is going to give you any negative feedback, any negative energy. And then because of where we are in the world today and the ridiculous amount of pornography that lives out in cyberspace, you can see whatever you want. You're watching a white guy and a white girl go at it. Well, why do we need a guy there? Hit a button. There's two girls. Well, this is kind of vanilla for me. I'd like a black girl and an Asian girl instead of two white girls. Boom. I was wrong. I want a white girl too, so let's throw 3 in there. Boom. Well, wouldn't this be cooler if there was a mariachi band playing next to them? Boom. Well, let's get some leprechauns throwing fish sticks in there too. Boom. There's so much porn out there that you can hook up whatever you want. Only 2% of humans, or only 2% of people are ever going to be in an orgy. Less than 20% of people are ever going to be in a 3-way. Less than 20% of people are ever going to have anal sex. So you have power to a world that you may never have access to. So when you're sitting there in that chair or laying in bed, you are the god of the sexual universe. You can hook up you want to watch a simple girl walking down a beach and that's what you like? It's there. You want to watch crazy Caligula kind of level stuff? That's there too, and everything in between. It's very powerful to be able to push some buttons and get exactly what you want. And I think that's really where you see the coping technique, is that it allows you to give yourself a false sense of power and control in your life.
What happens when a young person finds this? Because if people are as young as 11 or 12, the way that their brain develops and responds to sexual education and then sexual encounters is very different from someone who, it's increasingly rare now, but let's say is 25 and discovers this. When they have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. How do we compare and contrast those things? Is it more dangerous for the young person?
Well, the yes, and I'll also say, in seeing over 600 clients, nobody becomes a porn addict at 25. They may start to address it at 25, but nobody sees porn for the first time then. Nobody becomes an addict then. I can think of two people off the top of my head I've talked with who became an addict at 18 or older. The reality is, when I became an addict, I was 12 years old. Back then, the average boy became an addict at 13 or 14. Now the average boy sees porn between 8 and 10 for the first time and is getting addicted at 11. So aside from the 25-year-old to the 15-year-old comparison, what we need to recognize is the 13-year-old to the 10-year-old comparison. Those are 3 big years right there. Along with the fact of, think about my journey of being a porn addict. I was looking at Playboy magazine. It's a naked woman who is airbrushed. It is not super explicit. It is R-rated. It's not super X-rated. So I would get a picture, I would get a handful of pictures of a girl or a couple girls every month in that magazine, and that's that. Now, any 8-year-old who can spell man, sex, and woman, which, let's admit, are pretty easy words to spell, can watch that graphically. So we have to recognize that the age of sexualization of children is dropping, and they're seeing content that is far more explicit than people of my generation or even the older half of the millennials got. What happens? We're still studying this. This is one of the reasons why it's not accepted as a scientific addiction, is because the studying is so new. They were studying alcoholism in the 20s when AA was started. The American Psychiatric Association did not accept alcohol use disorder as a true problem until the 1970s. That was 50 years of study they had to do. So ultimately, when I'm working with people, I don't necessarily worry about labels, because there's no blood test for any of this. There's no blood test for ADD. There's no blood test for bipolar. There's no blood test for addiction. There's no blood test for anxiety. When I sit down with a client, whatever diagnoses you've got from other people, great. Let's just sit down and talk about who you are. And the real thing is, this isn't about getting you to quit porn, the behavior. Your porn use is a symptom of larger things. What are those larger things? A more important question to answer is not, how do I quit? It's, why did I even start in the first place? How did I get here? These are the important things to ask yourself. How did pornography shape who I am? And what age was I introduced, to get back to your original point? If I was introduced at 8 years old, suddenly my second grade teacher is not just Mrs. Smith, the nice lady who gives hugs and shows me how to do cursive writing. She's that lady who hugs me and her big boobs touch my head. I see the little girls in school, and suddenly they're not just my little friends. These are going to grow up to be different. And it seems like this is what I should go after. you're an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid regularly watching porn, you probably even haven't been giving the birds and the bees speech yet. You may not even know that what you're watching is what people do to make babies. They conveniently leave that out of porn. Um, I think that it's the first step of sexual unhealthiness. If you are going to start to watch fictional depictions of sexual activity, at 9 years old, you don't recognize this is a movie. This is fictional. People who, those of us who have had healthy sexual relationships understand the way that it's done in porn. It's not the way real people do it. But if you're 9 or 10, how are you going to know that? If you're 9 or 10, this is your sex education. And it is going to give you a very warped view. I have several of my followers on TikTok are actually porn stars whose names people would recognize, who I've had some wonderful conversations with. And many have said, keep doing what you're doing. Keep telling everybody this is not a reality show. Keep telling everybody this is not a documentary. The way you see me do it on film with a guy, a 10-minute session that actually took 8 hours to film, I don't have sex with my own boyfriend that way. It's a performance. It's an act. But these small kids aren't recognizing it. These small kids who are growing into teenagers, who are growing into young adults, think that this is how you interact sexually. This is healthy sexuality. And that's where we're starting to see certain repercussions from this just starting to happen now. And it's only going to get worse until we are willing to talk about this in the open.
So, what does being exposed to porn nowadays look like? Because I would be hesitant to suggest that it just means going on an adult film site and clicking a random video. It seems like that pipeline is much more blurred. So I think that if you're consuming modern advertisements, if you're on Instagram and you're seeing hypersexualized people on there, that's a natural pipeline. Where does that pipeline to pornography exist, and how should young people be cognizant and aware of they're kind of training their brain to hypersexualize not just themselves but everybody else?
Well, and this is where we need parents to get involved. This is where we need schools to recognize that it's, at the time we film this, 2025, and that this is an issue. It wasn't an issue 30 years ago. I mean, there was porn addiction 30 years ago. I was one. But the numbers were so much lower. The advent of high-speed internet changed everything. The advent of give every 10-year-old a smartphone changed everything. When I was 14, my challenge was to find pornography first. Now that challenge doesn't exist. And as parents, we need to set our children up for success. And you said at the top of the show, this is going to be a very explicit show. Well, it hasn't been so far because it doesn't have to be. We can talk about the concepts of pornography without talking about the hardcore content. And I think that's what you need to do with kids. And you need to recognize this isn't the birds and the bees speech. You can be very age appropriate and consider it like the why we don't drink in this house speech, why we don't smoke cigarettes in this house. It's okay to tell a 4-year-old, hey, I just want to let you know, a rule. You don't ever let anybody take pictures of you without your clothes on, and you don't ever take pictures of anybody else with their clothes off. And then when they get into school, hey, I just want to let you know you may have a friend who has a phone or a tablet, and you may see pictures of naked people on there, either alone or together, maybe looking like they're wrestling. Kids aren't supposed to see this stuff, just like kids aren't supposed to smoke cigarettes, just like kids aren't supposed to drink beer. This isn't good for kids. And when you're older, when you're my age and you're a grown up, you can make your own decisions of what you want to do. But in this house, the kids don't use this stuff: alcohol, cigarettes, pictures of people. I think you can make this not scary as it gets older. And then, especially with boys, when you get to 11 or 12, I think you tell them about porn-induced erectile dysfunction. I think you let them know that, hey, if over the next 5, 6 years you use this stuff a lot, the bottom line is that your penis can break. And if you don't want a broken penis, you can't use too much of this stuff. Because my guess is you don't want to look at this stuff all day. You want a girlfriend. Hold hands, kiss, whatever. I don't think 12-year-old boys are that much looking for sex. They want a girl to pay a little bit of attention to them. The girls aren't going to pay attention to you when you're 17 or 18 if your penis is broken. That's not what they're interested in. So make sure you don't use too much of this stuff, because it will lead to a rougher life. And you don't make it scary, you just spell it out. And if we can get schools to take one day to explain the scientific reasons pornography is bad for you, ultimately it has to do with just educating. If we can educate without moralizing, like we've learned to do with drugs and alcohol in school, I think that's what we need to do. I think that's when we'll see the biggest steps, because yes, as adults in this society, we are leading children to a slaughter of unhealthy sexual thoughts and behaviors because we still have our Puritan minds from every generation before us. My grandparents, my parents, hugely conservative. The baby boomers and before that were hugely sexually conservative. Gen Z, the second half of the millennials, grew up with social media. If you're a 16-year-old girl, when I was in high school, you would have freaked if a photo of you in a bikini had been passed around. Now, it's basically expected that almost every girl who's 16 is going to have some bikini shots on her Instagram. So we're seeing the evolution of nudity, the evolution of sexuality not being taken as seriously as the conservative generations did in the past. What's this ultimately going to do? We're learning this in real time.
So, what are the differences between a male using pornography and a female using pornography? Because it feels like the contemporary discussion on porn is centered around young males. Is there a new discussion or a parallel discussion to be had on females or young females
and there
using porn?
needs to be more, because so many females who suffer with porn addiction feel like they have nowhere to go. Feel like, oh my God, I've got a guy's disease. You know, this is like jock itch. How do I have this? And it's simple. You've got working body, you've got working genitals down there, you've got a working brain. Why wouldn't you have this? It's just that throughout society, or I should say probably since about the 1950s and 60s, while we've had mass media, the only market that the pornographers could count on was straight white men. That's who porn was made for forever, because they could count on the straight white men to show up at the theaters. They could count on the straight white men to go to the adult bookstore and buy the material. You didn't get women there. You didn't get people of color there. You didn't get religious people there. But now that everybody can access this privately, it's blowing up. A couple of statistics, doesn't have to do with addiction, but post-pandemic statistics suggest that in the world, 91% of men who have access to the internet look at porn at least once a month. Perhaps more surprisingly, just over 60% of women look at porn at least once a month. So 9 out of 10 men, 6 out of 10 women. You're actually far more rare if you're not looking at porn these days. Now, when it comes to the addictive side of things, it's largely the same story. It's largely the same reasons because it goes back to trauma. Divorce is divorce, betrayal is betrayal, abuse, whether it be sexual or emotional or whatever, is abuse. The only real difference in having to talk to men over women is that men get erection problems and women don't. That is the number one difference. And the only other real difference that I see between men and women when I coach them is that probably 75% of my clients, and I bet this is true of just most women in general, having spoken with them, they watch only exclusively female pornography. Women prefer to watch women, just like most straight guys do. Men won't watch gay pornography. They may go look for 3 seconds just to see what the hell is this, but they don't watch gay pornography. Men watch trans pornography. And I don't know if that's just like halfway to getting there, like it still allows a guy to say, well, he's got nice boobs, or, well, she's got a big penis. Maybe it allows a step into that area. Women are much more comfortable watching women. And I have heard various theories as to why from the women and from others. That's the biggest difference, I would say, is that 75% of my female clients watch only female pornography, and there's not a lesbian in the group, and I think there's one bisexual person. It's just what they're far more comfortable with.
We should definitely talk about, because we started with culture, and now I think we should go to the neuroscience and behavioral psychology and kind of the just what happens to the body. But what is porn-induced erectile dysfunction? Obviously, it's in the name, but what precisely is it?
It's not a new phenomenon, but it is an exploding phenomenon. The research suggests that 25 years ago, around the time I was 20, male rates of erectile dysfunction were around 2 to 4%. Today, depending on the study you read, it's anywhere from 18 to 25%. And around with 20-year-old guys. I know with my clients who are in that age group for guys, it's probably 80%. What's happening is that you are given, from a very young age, you are giving yourself a toxic amount of brain chemicals. Now, these are the pleasure chemicals: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, all the stuff that naturally makes us feel very good. Whether we're exercising, whether we're, having fun with friends, whether we're in love, whatever it may be, those pleasure chemicals exist normally and are good. However, when we, as addicts, discover this hack that we can create this stuff in our head, and granted, most of us don't know the neuroscience, we just think, oh, feels good. What we're doing is creating 4 times the natural chemicals. That's a toxic amount. That starts to degrade the brain. That starts to cause brain damage. If you can go online and look at the brains of addicts, and they look diseased. And the addictive brain of a porn addict looks most closely like the addictive brain of a cocaine addict. That's how strong this is. And people have to understand this porn addiction is a disease. Because addiction is a disease, it changes the chemistry of the brain. The brain of an addict is not the brain of a non-addict. And with PIED, what you do is, in changing that brain chemistry, you are causing the real world to not be enough. Let's imagine that you have a girlfriend. You've been with her for 2 years. You're sexually active. How many hundreds of times have you seen her naked? How many, hundreds of times have you had sex? Most people, their sex lives with the same partner over and over gets into a routine. You're going to do this, then I'm going to do this. Then you're going to do this, then I'm going to do this. You know how that movie ends. But when you're sitting in front of porn, you're going to get a huge hit of dopamine. You're with your wife or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or your husband. Well, I mean, I guess it would be girlfriend or wife if we're talking erectile problems. You you know that story that's laying in the bed. You know those body parts that's laying in the bed. It's not causing those kinds of chemicals to be introduced. We know that new imagery, what's called novel imagery, this is what we want. This is what's going to stir our pleasure centers. Many guys can get an erection. Many guys can finish with pornography, but can't do that with their partner because they can't create the chemicals that are needed with the partner. They need new imagery again and again and again. Most people don't use the same porn twice because it doesn't do for them what it did before. One of the hallmarks of addiction is that most addicts during one of their sessions will spend an amount of time looking for the last piece to finish with, looking for that perfect piece to end their session on, because subconsciously they understand they're going to get the biggest hit out of that. That's going to cause the most pleasure. Well, you go home and there she is, not looking like one of these plastic people, not willing to do whatever you want just because you can hit a button. And there you go. It's the same show again and again and again, 5 nights a week. You may not, you very well may not be able to get an erection. And even if you can, you very well may not be able to finish. But you still can with pornography. And then in the absolute worst cases, even the pornography stops working, and there's nothing you can do because your brain is so essentially fried that you've got to give it time to heal, to feel anything again. And that's usually when I get a lot of my clients is that, my penis hasn't worked in 6 months. I haven't been able to ejaculate in, 8 months. What's going on? And it's then the first two rules are very simple. Don't look, don't touch. And if you can't do that, you're probably not going to get over it.
Is it just in terms of the physical intimacy and physical inability, or is there also an emotional component to
Huge,
that?
huge side of that because that's why we use. We use to deal with the emotions of the trauma of the past, and we've trained ourselves. This is what we do. The reasons I started using at 12 years old were not the reasons I was using as a 35-year-old man. My anxieties were different. My stressors were different, but it was still my only coping technique. And that's what people need to truly, get beyond the naked people doing the naked stuff. This isn't about hypersexuality. This isn't about perversion. This isn't about a lack of morals. This is about, this is how I deal with the world, and I have no other idea how to deal with the world. When I went to rehab and it was, basically this, you can't look at porn anymore, you can't masturbate anymore, and you can't drink anymore. Well, what the hell do I do? Because this is what I do. How do I handle problems? And that's the process that I had to learn. I had to process my trauma. In processing my trauma, it became so much easier to drop the addictions. I had those addictions because I didn't know how to cope with problems. I had these problems from way in the past that were never dealt with. If you have massive traumas when you're young, they're going to affect all your decisions moving forward. That's what you have to establish. If you are, a young kid in school and you've got the mean girls bullying you day after day, you may end up being a 25-year-old guy who's scared to death to talk to girls because they're going to make you feel bad like they did when you were 12. And that's just something you've carried with you forever. But you may not realize that. I'm shy. Well, you weren't born shy. What happened? And this is what's the most important part, is going back and telling yourself that story. I tell people what we're going to do for the first time ever is you're going to tell me your story, and I'm going to challenge you on it because you've been telling yourself a fictional story for a long time. So you can cope with your life. We need to go back and work with that trauma. That's where the addiction lives, is up here. That's what we have to focus on. That's what we have to change. And yeah, you will quit the behavior along the way, but I don't want you quitting porn and then becoming a gambler. I don't want you quitting porn and becoming a drinker. This is just switching addictions. We have to go and really work with the mental side of this. We have to allow you to make connections. We have to have you understand why certain things happened. We have to make you understand why you reacted the way you did to those certain things. Again, it doesn't come down to how do I quit the behavior of using porn. It comes down to how did I get to this place? How did I become the person I am today? Because odds are, if you're an addict, you've been gaslighting yourself along the way. Why are addicts such great gaslighters? Why are addicts such great liars? Why are addicts such great manipulators? Because we learned to do it on ourselves. And if we can manipulate ourselves into any situation, we can do it to you. I should have had a PhD in manipulation come with my high school diploma, because I was already that good at it. That's who addicts are.
Also, in your practice, do you see that porn leads to sexual violence and, it affects consent culture at all? Because that's a really big deal right now. And I know there were some studies that say that if you consume some of the top-rated pornography, which has sexual violence against women perpetrated by men, you're like 6 times more likely to commit sexual violence down the line. Does that track with what you find?
This world is evolving so fast that, to me, any statistics on anybody under 25 don't matter because they're old. Any statistics that come from before the pandemic, which radically changed the online world of pornography, are kind of pointless. I wish there was more studies happening so we could better understand, but if you're going to give me a speech about how 20-year-olds are consuming pornography based on your 2015 data, well, in 2015, there was no TikTok. In 2015, there was no OnlyFans. In 2015, the cam model industry was just getting started because the technology was just getting there. Now, 10 years later, we consume porn so differently than we did 10 years ago. And in 2015, we consumed porn much differently than we did in 2005. So I take a lot of statistics with a grain of salt because this world is changing so fast. Will pornography tend to dull the sexual priorities? Will it tell a story that may form people in a certain way? Yeah, of course. Of course. There was a study by a Canadian college that looked at the top 100 videos on 2 of the major porn websites. They found that 97% of the videos, male, female, had aggression either physical, far more often verbal, toward the female. And you're right. A 10-year-old boy watching this, he thinks he's watching a real thing. Puts the hand on the guy puts the hand on the throat. The guy is calling her degrading names. The guy is bending her into ways that real people don't have sex. And this doesn't even talk about how degrading it is how most men finish in these videos. Not the way you make babies. Normalizing this for children is going to cause problems. I don't think this in and of itself causes sexual violence, but I think it can certainly be a factor. I think it can lead to a attitude or belief system that is skewed. And to get a little less sinister, one of the things that I've learned in doing my work, I was giving a speech shortly before the pandemic, so we're now talking 5-6 years ago, at a nearby college to a women's health group. I did my whole song and dance, and we got to the Q&A, and one young woman raised her hand and said, "Do you know anything about a culture, or have you heard that a lot of women our age don't want to have sex with virgin men?" And I said, "I don't know about this," but I saw the other girls' faces kind of light up in agreement. Since this time, I've talked to hundreds of women and found this to be true. Many women don't want to have sex with inexperienced men or with virgin men because they now have grown up on thousands of hours of pornography. So you can get a guy who seems nice, who seems studious, who seems courteous, 18 years old, sexually inexperienced. You bring him back to your dorm room, or you bring him back to your apartment, and you get into the bedroom, and all of a sudden, he pushes you onto the bed. Let's go, bitch. What happened to you? Well, what happened to you was thousands of hours of pornography. And these women almost have to reprogram these guys or deprogram these guys so they can reprogram them, and they don't want to. So they skip these guys. They don't want to be with these sexually experienced guys, which is another whole issue for these guys. I think that this is where you start to see some of the issues with high-speed pornography or access to pornography. 20 years ago, there was no incel culture. 20 years ago, there was no nofap culture. 20 years ago, there was no Andrew Tate culture. And 20 years ago, far more people who were 20 were having sex. Gen Z is having less, or the adult age of Gen Z, people born after 97, they are having less sex than any generation going back 110 years when they started actually getting some data about this stuff. And I'm doing a survey at the moment for a conference that I'm going to be appearing at, talking specifically to Gen Z and giving them a survey. I'm finding that 35 to 40% of Gen Zers who are adults haven't had sex. And at all. I mean, they're having sex with themselves, but they're not having sex with a partner. They've never had sex with a partner. That is one of the early things that we're learning, but this isn't really getting out there very much, that the current generation of, people who are 15 to 30 are having less sex than any time in our recorded history with sexuality. Your great grandparents were getting it on more than your friends.
See, that doesn't make any sense because, not that what you're saying is incorrect, but just with the way the culture is right now, it's so hypersexualized. And so you would think that your pursuit and your need to have sex would kind of be the only thing you think about. And so in that pursuit, it kind of becomes like a U-turn almost. Like that energy, instead of being directed outward, is being directed inward. Yeah. So you just have lots of sex with yourself. How do you get out of that cycle? That's the biggest thing is if you maybe a better question to ask is what constitutes being addicted to pornography? Is there a way to use pornography in a casual,
Absolutely.
like I just need a release this
Absolutely.
week?
Well, statistics suggest that with men, about 15 to 20%, depending on what survey you read, about 15 to 20% will have addiction level issues. With women, it's about 10 to 12% who use will have addiction level issues. Um, for me, I look at the broad definition of addiction, which there are many little changes from definition to definition. I think mostly semantics. To me, the definition of addiction is that you are engaged in a behavior that, despite understanding this is going to end badly, potentially catastrophically, you do not have the power to turn it around. Well, how do you get that power? You have to decide that it's more important. You have to be willing to let your ego go. You have to be willing to seek out help from people who know more. You have to be willing to make massive lifestyle changes. You have to be able to make massive mindset changes. That's what's necessary. And when it comes, and I do see a lot of guys in their early 20s who do have difficulties with women, and it comes down to a simple thing: self-love and confidence. They don't think that they are worthy of a woman's love or a woman's affection. They think that they are less than. They think that they are going to get rejected. They think they're going to get turned down. And that they fear that too much. They're afraid of that too much. There's a confidence problem among our young men and our young women in this world. That's ultimately what it is. I tell people, you only have to get one relationship right in your whole life. Only one. How does a successful relationship end? One of you dies of old age. That's how a successful relationship ends. And you only have to get one of those in life. Some people meet that person in high school. Some people don't meet that person till they're 50. But you have to be willing to put yourself out there. If you want to receive love, you need to give love. And more often than not, it doesn't end well. Much like buying a pet. When you buy a pet or you get a pet, you know it's not going to end well, because either that animal dies or you die. It doesn't end well. But you still do it anyway, because of all the pleasure that comes along the way, because of the companionship, because of the love for that pet. Well, you need to do that with somebody who you're interested in or attracted to. And you need to develop that confidence. You need to work on yourself. The way that you're working on yourself as an addict, you need to work on yourself as a man or woman. That's a lot of what we do. Is to me, the third step of recovery is, number one, quit the behavior. Number two, understand the traumatic response that caused the behavior. Number three, who do you want to be moving forward, and how do we get you there? Maybe it's online dating. Maybe it's joining a class where there are just other women around. If you're at a point, or men around, if you're at a point you can't even talk to them, don't go on a date. Just learn to talk to them before you ask one out. You have to address your development where you're at. And that's part of my job, is to recognize where a guy or a girl is developmentally and what their goals are. If you want to be alone the rest of your life, well, then we don't need to work on relationship skills when it comes to a significant other. Maybe we have to work on them with coworkers or friends, but you don't need it in that area. But we have to figure out, who do you want to be, and what steps can we take to begin your journey in that direction? To me, that's the end part, or the ongoing part of recovery.
Fantastic. Joshua, just two more questions for you. If you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
Poverty. Poverty. We would all live much better. We would all be much healthier. We would all have access to medicine, to enough food, to a decent education. I would solve poverty because I think the ripple effects of that would be magnificent.
Can you say more about the ripple effects?
Well, like I said, if we don't have poverty, everybody who needs an EpiPen is going to get one. If we don't have poverty, those kids starving in Africa will be properly nourished. Maybe cancer will be solved by some kid living in a hut right now, but because he's not getting enough food, because his culture does not prioritize going to school because they're just trying to survive. That's what I mean. If there were no homeless people, if there were kids who were not malnourished, all of these problems can be solved by bringing people out of the poverty level because it's going to just improve them as people, and improved people have make an improved world.
Last question for you. What gives you hope in the world?
Ah, that I'll be dead within 50 years. Um, which is dark. What gives me hope in the world is that when push comes to shove, we usually do figure this stuff out. We just wait too long. We're a reactionary society. We're not proactive. And I talk about this in terms of the opiate crisis, the opioid crisis. Back in 2017, 2018, I don't know why, but politicians suddenly started caring. Mainstream media suddenly started caring. Oh my God, look at this crisis. You can go back to rappers from the 80s talking about abusing Vicodin. You can go back to cop shows from the 60s where they're talking about things like heroin. We've always known there's an opiate and opioid crisis, but we lumped them in with drug users. And in the 80s, with Nancy Reagan and the DARE program, just say no. Well, just say no to these people. These people are from the wrong side of the tracks. What kind of a person uses drugs? And I was raised to believe that the drug user is somehow a degenerate. Well, that's not going to get somebody who's a drug user to feel safe asking me about it. That's not going to make a drug user feel safe of getting help. So it just multiplied and multiplied. And finally, in 2017-18, we started caring. It was a reaction to what was a problem we could have proactively addressed 35, 40 years earlier. And then the pandemic hit. You rarely hear any politician talk about opiates and opioids anymore because there's other more pressing, glittery stuff happening. And we can see that we are headed in a very negative, very unhealthy direction sexually. And maybe we'll deal with this in 2040. Maybe we'll deal with this in 2050. But wouldn't it be great to deal with it now? And that's what it's going to take to fix this. I don't know if that answers the question, but we cannot be a reactionary society. We need to be a proactive society when it comes to dealing with our problems. Let's get ahead of the problems instead of just reacting to them.
Roger that. Well, I thank you for helping us being a proactive society because without people like you, we would still be reactionary. So, we all appreciate the work that you're doing and the work that you continue to do. In light of that, where can we find and support you? You have 4 books. Do you have other work that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I right now, almost all of my time is devoted to coaching. I do this outreach podcast. I haven't written a book in a while, although I have 2 projects currently brewing. And I have returned a little bit to the presentation world after taking many years off from it. You can get all of my information, all of my books, all of my coaching info, everything you need to know from thatcorncoach.com. And if you go through socials, I am always that corn coach in my socials. I would push people toward TikTok more than anything else.
Fantastic. We'll put all those links in the show notes. Joshua, thank you so much for your time today.
And thank you for having me. I appreciate it.